Chapter 16 of Lorna Doone by Richard D. Blackmore. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Chloe Winters, August 2008. Lorna Doone by R. D. Blackmore. Chapter 16. Lorna growing formidable. Having reconnoitred thus the position of the enemy, Master Huckaback, on the homeward road, cross-examined me in a manner not at all desirable. For he had noted my confusion and eager gaze at something unseen by him in the valley, and thereupon he made up his mind to know everything about it. In this, however, he partly failed, for although I was no hand at fence, and would not tell him a falsehood, I managed so to hold my peace that he put himself upon the wrong track, and continued thereon with many vaunts of his shrewdness and experience, and some chuckles at my simplicity. Thus much, however, he learned aright, that I had been in the Doone Valley several years before, and might be brought upon strong inducement to venture there again. But as to the mode of my getting in, the things I saw and my thoughts upon them, he not only failed to learn the truth, but certified himself into an obstinacy of error, from which no after-knowledge was able to deliver him. And this he did, not only because I happened to say very little, but forasmuch as he disbelieved half of the truth I told him, through his own too great sagacity. Upon one point, however, he succeeded more easily than he expected, viz., in making me promise to visit the place again as soon as occasion offered, and to hold my own counsel about it. But I could not help smiling at one thing, that according to his point of view my own counsel meant my own and Master Ribbon Huckaback's. Now he being gone, as he went next day, to his favourite town of Dulverton, and leaving behind him shadowy promise of the mountains he would do for me, my spirit began to burn and pant for something to go on with. And nothing showed a braver hope of movement and adventure than a lonely visit to Glen Doone, by way of the perilous passage discovered in my boyhood. Therefore I waited for nothing more than the slow arrival of new small clothes made by a good tailor at Porlock, for I was wishful to look my best. And when they were come and approved, I started, regardless of the expense, and forgetting, like a fool, how badly they would take the water. What with urging of the tailor and my own misgivings, the time was now come round again to the high day of St. Valentine, when all our maids were full of lovers, and all the lads looked foolish, and none of them more sheepish or innocent than I myself, albeit 21 years old, and not afraid of men much, but terrified of women at least, if they were comely. And what of all things scared me most was the thought of my own size, and knowledge of my strength, which came like knots upon me daily. In honest truth I tell this thing, which often since hath puzzled me, when I came to mix with men more. I was to that degree ashamed of my thickness and my stature, in the presence of a woman, that I would not put a trunk of wood on the fire in the kitchen, but let Annie scold me well, with a smile to follow, and with her own plump hands lift up a little log and fuel it. Many a time I longed to be no bigger than John Fry was, whom now, when insolent, I took with my left hand by the waist-stuff, and set him on my hat, and gave him little chance to tread it, until he spoke of his family and requested to come down again. Now taking for good omen this, that I was a 7-year Valentine, though much too big for a Cupidon, I chose a 7-foot staff of ash, and fixed a loach-fork in it, to look as I had looked before, and leaving word upon matters of business, out of the back door I went, and so through the little orchard, and down the brawling Lynbrook. Not being now so much afraid, I struck across the thicket land, between the meeting waters, and came upon the Bagworthy stream near the great black whirlpool. Nothing amazed me so much as to find how shallow the stream now looked to me, although the pool was still as black and greedy as it used to be. And still the great rocky slide was dark and difficult to climb, though the water which once had taken my knees was satisfied now with my ankles. After some labour I reached the top, and halted to look about me well, before trusting to broad daylight. The winter, as I said before, had been a very mild one, and now the spring was toward, so that bank and bush were touched with it. The valley into which I gazed was fair with early promise, having shelter from the wind and taking all the sunshine. The willow bushes over the stream hung as if they were angling with tasselled floats of gold and silver, bursting like a bean-pod. Between them came the water, laughing like a maid at her own dancing, and spread with that young blue which never lives beyond the April. And on either bank the meadow ruffled as the breeze came by, opening through new tuft of green, daisy bud or celandine, or a shy glimpse now and then of the love-lorn primrose. Though I am so blank of wit, or perhaps for that same reason, these little things come and dwell with me, and I am happy about them, and long for nothing better. I feel with every blade of grass as if it had a history, and make a child of every bud as though it knew and loved me. And being so, they seem to tell me of my own delusions, how I am no more than they, except in self-importance. While I was forgetting much of many things that harm one, and letting of my thoughts go wild to sounds and sights of nature, a sweeter note than thrush or ouzel ever wooed a maid in, floated on the valley breeze at the quiet turn of sundown. The words were of an ancient song, fit to laugh or cry at. Love, and if there be one, come my love to be. My love is for the one, loving unto me. Not for me the show, love, of a gilded bliss. Only thou must know, love, what my value is. If in all the earth, love, thou hast none but me, this shall be my worth, love, to be cheap to thee. But, if so thou ever strivest to be free, 'twill be my endeavour to be dear to thee. So shall I have plea, love, is thy heart and breath clinging still to thee, love, in the doom of death. All this I took in with great eagerness, not for the sake of the meaning, which is no doubt an allegory, but for the power and richness and softness of the singing, which seemed to me better than we ever had even in our church. But all the time I kept myself in a black niche of the rock, where the fall of the water began, lest the sweet singer, espying me, should be alarmed and flee away. But presently I ventured to look forth where a bush was, and then I beheld the loveliest sight, one glimpse of which was enough to make me kneel in the coldest water. By the side of the stream she was coming to me, even among the primroses, as if she loved them all, and every flower looked the brighter as her eyes were on them. I could not see what her face was, my heart so awoke and trembled, only that her hair was flowing from a wreath of white violets, and the grace of her coming was like the appearance of the first wind-flower. The pale gleam over the western cliffs threw a shadow of light behind her, as if the sun were lingering. Never do I see that light from the closing of the west, even in these my aged days, without thinking of her. Ah me, if it comes to that, what do I see of earth or heaven without thinking of her? The tremulous thrill of a song was hanging on her open lips, and she glanced around, as if the birds were accustomed to make answer. To me it was a thing of terror to behold such beauty, and feel myself the while to be so very low and common. But scarcely knowing what I did, as if a rope were drawing me, I came from the dark mouth of the chasm, and stood, afraid to look at her. She was turning to fly, not knowing me, and frightened perhaps of my stature, when I fell on the grass, as I fell before her 7 years agone that day, and I just said, "Lorna Doone." She knew me at once, from my manner and ways, and a smile broke through her trembling, as sunshine comes through aspen leaves. And being so clever, she saw, of course, that she needed not to fear me. "Oh, indeed!" she cried with a feint of anger, because she had shown a cowardice, and yet in her heart she was laughing. "Oh, if you please, who are you, sir? And how do you know my name?" "I am John Ridd," I answered, "the boy who gave you those beautiful fish when you were only a little thing, 7 years ago today." "Yes, the poor boy who was frightened so, and obliged to hide here in the water." "And do you remember how kind you were, and saved my life by your quickness, and went away riding upon a great man's shoulder as if you had never seen me, and yet looked back through the willow trees?" "Oh yes, I remember everything, because it was so rare to see any because I happened to remember. But you seem not to remember, sir, how perilous this place is." For she had kept her eyes upon me, large eyes of a softness, a brightness, and a dignity which made me feel as if I must forever love and yet forever know myself unworthy, unless themselves should fill with love, which is the spring of all things. And so I could not answer her, but was overcome with thinking and feeling and confusion. Neither could I look again, only waited for the melody which made every word like a poem to me, the melody of her voice. But she had not the least idea of what was going on with me, any more than I myself had. "I think, Master Ridd, you cannot know," she said, with her eyes taken from me, "what the dangers of this place are, and the nature of the people." Yes, I know enough of that, and I am frightened greatly all the time when I do not look at you. She was too young to answer me in the style some maidens would have used, the manner, I mean, which now we call from a foreign word coquettish, and more than that, she was trembling with real fear of violence, lest strong hands might be laid on me, and a miserable end of it. And to tell the truth, I grew afraid, perhaps from a kind of sympathy, and because I knew that evil comes more readily than good to us. Therefore, without more ado, or taking any advantage, although I would have been glad at heart, if needs had been, to kiss her, without any thought of rudeness, it struck me that I had better go, and have no more to say to her until next time of coming. So would she look the more for me, and think the more about me, and not grow weary of my words and the want of change there is in me. For of course I knew what a churl I was compared to her birth and appearance. But meanwhile I might improve myself and learn a musical instrument. The wind hath a draw after flying straw is a saying we have in Devonshire, made, peradventure, by someone who had seen the ways of women. Mistress Lorna, I will depart. Mark you, I thought that a powerful word, in fear of causing disquiet. If any rogue shot me, it would grieve you, I make bold to say it, and it would be the death of mother. Few mothers have such a son as me. Try to think of me now and then, and I will bring you some new-laid eggs, for our young blue hen is beginning. I thank you heartily, said Lorna, but you need not come to see me. You can put them in my little bower, where I am almost always, I mean whither daily I repair to read and to be away from them. Only show me where it is. Thrice a day I will come and stop. Nay, Master Ridd, I would never show thee, never because of peril, only that so happens it thou hast found the way already. And she smiled with a light that made me care to cry out for no other way, except to a dear heart. But only to myself I cried for anything at all, having enough of man in me to be bashful with young maidens. So I touched her white hand softly when she gave it to me, and, fancying that she had sighed, was touched at heart about it, and resolved to yield her all my goods, although my mother was living, and then grew angry with myself, for a mile or more of walking, to think she would condescend so, and then, for the rest of the homeward road, was mad with every man in the world who would dare to think of having her. End of chapter 16. Recorded by Chloe Winters, August 2008.
Of Lorna Doone. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Lorna Doone by R.D. Blackmore. Chapter 17. John is clearly bewitched. To forget one's luck of life, to forget the cark of care and withering of young fingers, not to feel, or not to be moved by all the change of thought and heart, from large young heat to the sinewy lines and dry bones of old age, this is what I have to do, ere ever I can make you know, even as a dream is known, how I loved my Lorna. I myself can never know, never can conceive or treat it as a thing of reason, never can behold myself dwelling in the midst of it, and think that this was I, neither can I wander far from perpetual thought of it. Perhaps I have 2 farrows of pigs ready for the chapman, perhaps I have 10 stones of wool waiting for the factor. It is all the same. I look at both, and what I say to myself is this: which would Lorna choose of them? Of course I am a fool for this. Any man may call me so, and I will not quarrel with him, unless he guess my secret. Of course I fetch my wit, if it be worth the fetching, back again to business; but there my heart is, and must be, and all who like to try can cheat me, except upon parish matters. That week I could do little more than dream, and rove about, seeking by perpetual change to find the way back to myself. I cared not for the people round me, neither took delight in victuals, but made believe to eat and drink, and blushed at any questions. And being called the master now, head farmer and chief yeoman, it irked me much that any one should take advantage of me. Yet everybody did so as soon as ever it was known that my wits were gone moon-raking. For that was the way they looked at it, not being able to comprehend the greatness and the loftiness. Neither do I blame them much, for the wisest thing is to laugh at people when we cannot understand them. I, for my part, took no notice, but in my heart despised them as beings of a lesser nature, who never had seen Lorna. Yet I was vexed, and rubbed myself, when John Fry spread all over the farm, and even at the shoeing forge, that a mad dog had come and bitten me, from the other side of Malond. This seems little to me now, and so it might to any one; but at the time it worked me up to a fever of indignity. To make a mad dog of Lorna, to compare all my imaginings (which were strange, I do assure you, the faculty not being apt to work), to count the raising of my soul no more than hydrophobia. All this acted on me so, that I gave John Fry the soundest threshing that ever a sheaf of good corn deserved, or a bundle of tares was blessed with. Afterwards he went home, too tired to tell his wife the meaning of it; but it proved of service to both of them, and an example to their children. Now the climate of this country is, so far as I can make of it, to throw no man into extremes; and if he throw himself so far, to pluck him back by change of weather, and the need of looking after things; lest we should be like the Southerns, for whom the sky does everything, and men sit under a wall, and watch both food and fruit come beckoning. Their sky is a mother to them, but ours a good stepmother to us, fearing to hurt by indulgence, and knowing that severity and change of mood are wholesome. The spring being now too forward, a check to it was needful, and in the early part of March there came a change of weather. All the young growth was arrested by a dry wind from the east, which made both face and fingers burn when a man was doing ditching. The lilacs and the woodbines, just crowding forth in little tufts, close kernelling their blossom, were ruffled back like a sleeve turned up, and nicked with brown at the corners. In the hedges any man, unless his eyes were very dull, could see the mischief doing. The russet of the young elm bloom was fain to be in scale again, but having pushed forth, there must be, and turned to a tawny colour. The hangers of the hazel, too, having shed their dust to make the nuts, did not spread their little combs and dry them as they ought to do, but shrivelled at the base, and fell as if a knife had cut them. And more than all to notice was, at least about the hedges, the shuddering of everything, and the shivering sound among them toward the feeble sun, such as we make to a poor fireplace, when several doors are open. Sometimes I put my face to warm against a soft rough maple stem, which feels like the foot of a red deer; but the pitiless east wind came through all, and took and shook the caved hedge aback till its knees were knocking together, and nothing could be shelter. Then would any one having blood, and trying to keep at home with it, run to a sturdy tree, and hope to eat his food behind it, and look for a little sun to come and warm his feet in the shelter. And if it did, he might strike his breast, and try to think he was warmer. But when a man came home at night, after a long day's labour, knowing that the days increased, and so his care should multiply, still he found enough of light to show him what the day had done against him in his garden. Every ridge of new turned earth looked like an old man's muscles, honeycombed, and standing out void of spring and powdery. Every plant that had rejoiced in passing such a winter, now was cowering, turned away, unfit to meet the consequence. Flowing sap had stopped its course, fluted lines showed want of food, and if you pinched the topmost spray, there was no rebound or firmness. We think a good deal, in a quiet way, when people ask us about them, of some fine upstanding pear trees, grafted by my grandfather, who had been very greatly respected. And he got those grafts by sheltering a poor Italian soldier, in the time of James I, a man who never could do enough to show his grateful memories. How he came to our place is a very difficult story, which I never understood rightly, having heard it from my mother. At any rate, there the pear trees were, and there they are to this very day, and I wish every one could taste their fruit, old as they are, and rugged. Now these fine trees had taken advantage of the west winds, and the moisture, and the promise of the springtime, so as to fill the tips of the spraywood, and the rowels all up the branches with a crowd of eager blossom. Not that they were yet in bloom, nor even showing whiteness, only that some of the cones were opening at the side of the cap which pinched them, and there you might count perhaps a dozen knobs, like very little buttons, but grooved and lined, and huddling close, to make room for one another. And among these buds were grey-green blades, scarce bigger than a hair almost, yet curving so as if their purpose was to shield the blossom. Other of the spur points, standing on the older wood where the sap was not so eager, had not burst their tunic yet, but were flayed and flaked with light, casting off the husk of brown in three-cornered patches, as I have seen a Scotchman's plaid, or as his legs shows through it. These buds, at a distance, looked as if the sky had been raining cream upon them. Now all this fair delight to the eyes, and good promise to the palate, was marred and baffled by the wind and cutting of the night frosts. The opening cones were struck with brown, in between the button buds and on the scapes that shielded them, while the foot part of the cover hung like rags, peeled back and quivering. And there the little stalk of each, which might have been a pear, God willing, had a ring around its base, and sought a chance to drop and die. The others, which had not open comb, but only prepared to do it, were a little better off, but still very brown and unkid, and shrivelling in doubt of health, and neither pert nor lusty. Now this I have not told because I know the way to do it, for that I do not, neither yet have seen a man who did know. It is wonderful how we look at things, and never think to notice them; and I am as bad as anybody, unless the thing to be observed is a dog, or a horse, or a maiden. And the last of those three I look at somehow, without knowing that I take notice, and greatly afraid to do it; only I knew afterwards, when the time of life was in me, not indeed what the maiden was like, but how she differed from others. Yet I have spoken about the spring, and the failure of fair promise, because I took it to my heart, as token of what would come to me in the budding of my years and hope. And even then, being much possessed, and full of a foolish melancholy, I felt a sad delight at being doomed to blight and loneliness. Not but that I managed still, when mother was urgent upon me, to eat my share of victuals, and cuff a man for laziness, and see that a ploughshare made no leaps, and sleep of a night without dreaming. And my mother, half believing, in her fondness and affection, that what the parish said was true about a mad dog having bitten me, and yet arguing that it must be false, because God would have prevented him. My mother gave me little rest when I was in the room with her. Not that she worried me with questions, nor openly regarded me with any unusual meaning; but that I knew she was watching slyly, whenever I took a spoon up, and every hour or so she managed to place a pan of water by me, quite as if by accident, and sometimes even to spill a little upon my shoe or coat sleeve. But Betty Muxworthy was the worst; for having no fear about my health, she made a villainous joke of it, and used to rush into the kitchen, barking like a dog, and panting, exclaiming that I had bitten her, and just as she would have on me, if it cost her a 12-month's wages. And she always took care to do this thing, just when I had crossed my legs in the corner after supper, and leaned my head against the oven, to begin to think of Lorna. However, in all things there is comfort, if we do not look too hard for it; and now I had much satisfaction in my uncouth state, from labouring by the hour together at the hedging and the ditching, meeting the bitter wind face to face, feeling my strength increase, and hoping that someone would be proud of it. In the rustling rush of every gust, in the graceful bend of every tree, even in the lords and ladies clumped in the scoops of the hedgerow, and most of all in the soft primrose, wrung by the wind, but stealing back, and smiling when the wrath was past; in all of these, and many others, there was aching ecstasy, delicious pang of Lorna. But however cold the weather was, and however hard the wind blew, one thing, more than all the rest, worried and perplexed me. This was, that I could not settle, turn and twist as I might, how soon I ought to go again upon a visit to Glen Doone. For I liked not at all the falseness of it, albeit against murderers, and the creeping out of sight, and hiding, and feeling as a spy might. And even more than this, I feared how Lorna might regard it; whether I might seem to her a prone and blunt intruder, a country youth not skilled in manners as among the quality, even when they rob us. For I was not sure myself, but that it might be very bad manners to go again too early without an invitation; and my hands and face were chapped so badly by the bitter wind, that Lorna might count them unsightly things, and wish to see no more of them. However, I could not bring myself to consult any one upon this point, at least in our own neighbourhood, nor even to speak of it near home. But the east wind holding through the month, my hands and face growing worse and worse, and it having occurred to me by this time that possibly Lorna might have chaps, if she came abroad at all, and so might like to talk about them, and show her little hands to me, I resolved to take another opinion, so far as might be upon this matter, without disclosing the circumstances. Now the wisest person in all our parts was reckoned to be a certain wise woman, well known all over Exmoor by the name of Mother Melldrum. Her real name was Maple Durham, as I learned long afterwards, and she came of an ancient family, but neither of Devon nor Somerset. Nevertheless, she was quite at home with our proper modes of divination, and knowing that we liked them best, as each man does his own religion, she would always practise them for the people of the country. And all the while she would let us know that she kept a higher and nobler mode for those who looked down upon this one, not having been bred and born to it. Mother Melldrum had 2 houses, or rather she had none at all, but 2 homes wherein to find her, according to the time of year. In summer she lived in a pleasant cave, facing the cool side of the hill, far inland near Hawkridge, and close above Tar Steps, a wonderful crossing of Barle River, made, as everybody knows, by Satan for a wager. But throughout the winter she found sea air agreeable, and a place where things could be had on credit, and more occasion of talking. Not but what she could have credit, for every one was afraid of her, in the neighbourhood of Tar Steps, only there was no one handy owning things worth taking. Therefore, at the fall of the leaf, when the woods grew damp and irksome, the wise woman always set her face to the warmer cliffs of the channel, where shelter was, and dry fern bedding, and folk to be seen in the distance, from a bank upon which the sun shone. And there, as I knew from our John Fry, who had been to her about rheumatism, and sheep possessed with an evil spirit, and warts on the hand of his son young John, any one who chose might find her, towards the close of a winter day, gathering sticks and brown fern for fuel, and talking to herself the while, in a hollow stretch behind the cliffs, which foreigners, who come and go without seeing much of Exmoor, have called the Valley of Rocks. This valley, or Goyal as we term it, being small for a valley, lies to the west of Linton, about a mile from the town perhaps, and away towards Leigh Manor. Our home folk always call it the Danes, or the Denes, which is no more, they tell me, than a hollow place, even as the word den is. However, let that pass, for I know very little about it; but the place itself is a pretty one, though nothing to frighten anybody, unless he hath lived in a gallipot. It is a green, rough-sided hollow, bending at the middle, touched with stone at either crest, and dotted here and there with slabs in and out the brambles. On the right hand is an upward crag, called by some the Castle, easy enough to scale, and giving great view of the channel. Facing this, from the inland side and the elbow of the valley, a queer old pile of rock arises, bold behind one another, and quite enough to affright a man, if it only were 10 times larger. This is called the Devil's Cheese Ring, or the Devil's Cheese Knife, which mean the same thing, as our fathers were used to eat their cheese from a scoop; and perhaps in old time the utmost rock, which has fallen away since I knew it, was like to such an implement, if Satan eat cheese untoasted. But all the middle of this valley was a place to rest in, to sit and think that troubles were not, if we would not make them. To know the sea outside the hills, but never to behold it, only by the sound of waves to pity sailors labouring. Then to watch the sheltered sun, coming warmly round the turn, like a guest expected, full of gentle glow and gladness, casting shadow far away, as a thing to hug itself, and awakening life from dew, and hope from every spreading bud; and then to fall asleep, and dream that the fern was all asparagus. Alas, I was too young in those days much to care for creature comforts, or to let pure palate have things that would improve it. Anything went down with me, as it does with most of us. Too late we know the good from bad; the knowledge is no pleasure then, being memory's medicine, rather than the wine of hope. Now Mother Melldrum kept her winter in this vale of rocks, sheltering from the wind and rain within the Devil's Cheese Ring, which added greatly to her fame, because all else, for miles around, were afraid to go near it after dark, or even on a gloomy day. Under eaves of lichened rock she had a winding passage, which none that I ever knew of durst enter but herself; and to this place I went to seek her, in spite of all misgivings, upon a Sunday in Lenten season, when the sheep were folded. Our parson, as if he had known my intent, had preached a beautiful sermon about the Witch of Endor, and the perils of them that meddle wantonly with the unseen powers; and therein he referred especially to the strange noise in the neighbourhood, and upbraided us for want of faith, and many other backslidings. We listened to him very earnestly, for we like to hear from our betters about things that are beyond us, and to be roused up now and then, like sheep with a good dog after them, who can pull some wool without biting. Nevertheless, we could not see how our want of faith could have made that noise, especially at night time; notwithstanding which we believed it, and hoped to do a little better. And so we all came home from church, and most of the people dined with us, as they always do on Sundays, because of the distance to go home, with only words inside them. The parson, who always sat next to mother, was afraid that he might have vexed us, and would not have the best piece of meat according to his custom. But soon we put him at his ease, and showed him we were proud of him; and then he made no more to do, but accepted the best of the sirloin. End of chapter 17. Read by Landy in Sydney, Australia, September 2008.
18 of Lorna Doone. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Michelle Harris. Lorna Doone by R.D. Blackmore. Chapter 18. Witchery Leads to Witchcraft. Although well nigh the end of March, the wind blew wild and piercing, as I went on foot that afternoon to Mother Meldrum's dwelling. It was safer not to take a horse, lest, if anything vexed her, she should put a spell upon him, as had been done to Farmer Snow's stable by the wise woman of Simon's Bath. The sun was low on the edge of the hills by the time I entered the valley, for I could not leave home till the cattle were tended, and the distance was 7 miles or more. The shadows of rocks fell far and deep, and the brown dead fern was fluttering, and brambles with their sere leaves hanging swayed their tatters to and fro with a red look on them. In patches underneath the crags a few wild goats were browsing, then they tossed their horns and fled, and leaped on ledges and stared at me. Moreover, the sound of the sea came up, and went the length of the valley, and there it lapped on a butt of rocks, and murmured like a shell. Taking things one with another, and feeling all the lonesomeness, and having no stick with me, I was much inclined to go briskly back, and come at a better season. And when I beheld a tall grey shape, of something or another, moving at the lower end of the valley, where the shade was, it gave me such a stroke of fear, after many others, that my thumb, which lay in mother's Bible, brought in my big pocket for the sake of safety, shook so much that it came out, and I could not get it in again. This serves me right, I said to myself, for tampering with Beelzebub. Oh, that I had listened to parson. And thereupon I struck aside, not liking to run away quite, as some people might call it, but seeking to look like a wanderer who was come to see the valley and had seen almost enough of it. Herein I should have succeeded, and gone home, and then been angry at my want of courage, but that on the very turn and bending of my footsteps, the woman in the distance lifted up her staff to me, so that I was bound to stop. And now, being brought face to face, by the will of God, as one might say, with anything that might come of it, I kept myself quite straight and stiff, and thrust away all white feather, trusting in my Bible still, hoping that it would protect me, though I had disobeyed it. But upon that remembrance my conscience took me by the leg, so that I could not go forward. All this while the fearful woman was coming near and more near to me, and I was glad to sit down on a rock, because my knees were shaking so. I tried to think of many things, but none of them would come to me, and I could not take my eyes away, though I prayed God to be near me. But when she was come so nigh to me that I could descry her features, there was something in her countenance that made me not dislike her. She looked as if she had been visited by many troubles, and had felt them one by one, yet held enough of kindly nature still to grieve for others. Long white hair, on either side, was falling down below her chin, and through her wrinkles clear bright eyes seemed to spread themselves upon me. Though I had plenty of time to think, I was taken by surprise no less, and unable to say anything, yet eager to hear the silence broken, and longing for a noise or two. "Thou art not come to me," she said, looking through my simple face as if it were but glass, "to be struck for bone shave, nor to be blessed for barn gun. Give me forth thy hand, John Ridd, and tell why thou art come to me." But I was so much amazed at her knowing my name and all about me, that I feared to place my hand in her power, or even my tongue by speaking. "Have no fear of me, my son. I have no gift to harm thee. And if I had, it should be idle. Now, if thou hast any wit, tell me why I love thee." "I never had any wit, mother," I answered in our Devonshire way, "and never set eyes on thee before, to the furthest of my knowledge." "And yet I know thee as well, John, as if thou wert my grandson. Remember you the old Oar Oak, and the bog at the head of Exie, and the child who would have died there, but for thy strength and courage, and most of all thy kindness? That was my granddaughter, John, and all I have on earth to love." Now that she came to speak of it, with the place and that, so clearly, I remembered all about it, a thing that happened last August, and thought how stupid I must have been not to learn more of the little girl who had fallen into the black pit with a basket full of whortleberries, and who might have been gulfed if her little dog had not spied me in the distance. I carried her on my back to mother, and then we dressed her all anew, and took her where she ordered us. But she did not tell us who she was, nor anything more than her Christian name, and that she was 8 years old, and fond of fried batatas. And we did not seek to ask her more, as our manner is with visitors. But thinking of this little story, and seeing how she looked at me, I lost my fear of Mother Meldrum, and began to like her; partly because I had helped her grandchild, and partly that if she were so wise, no need would have been for me to save the little thing from drowning. Therefore I stood up and said, though scarcely yet established in my power against hers, "Good mother, the shoe she lost was in the mire, and not with us; and we could not match it, although we gave her a pair of sister Lizzie's." "My son, what care I for her shoe? How simple thou art, and foolish, according to the thoughts of some. Now tell me, for thou canst not lie, what has brought thee to me?" Being so ashamed and bashful, I was half inclined to tell her a lie, until she said that I could not do it; and then I knew that I could not. "I am come to know," I said, looking at a rock the while, to keep my voice from shaking, "when I may go to see Lorna Doone." No more could I say, though my mind was charged to ask 50 other questions; but although I looked away, it was plain that I had asked enough. I felt that the wise woman gazed at me in wrath as well as sorrow; and then I grew angry that any one should seem to make light of Lorna. "John Ridd," said the woman, observing this, for now I faced her bravely, "of whom art thou speaking? Is it a child of the men who slew your father?" "I cannot tell, mother; how should I know? And what is that to thee?" "It is something to thy mother, John, and something to thyself, I trow; and nothing worse could befall thee." I waited for her to speak again, but she had spoken so sadly that it took my breath away. "John Ridd, if thou hast any value for thy body or thy soul, thy mother or thy father's name, have naught to do with any Doone." She gazed at me in earnest so, and raised her voice in saying it, until the whole valley, curving like a great bell, echoed "Doone," that it seemed to me my heart was gone for every one and everything. If it were God's will for me to have no more of Lorna, let a sign come out of the rocks, and I would try to believe it. But no sign came, and I turned to the woman, and longed that she had been a man. "You poor thing, with bones and blades, pails of water, and door keys, what know you about the destiny of a maiden such as Lorna? Chilblains you may treat, and bone shave, ringworm, and the scaldings; even scabby sheep may limp the better for your strikings. John the Baptist and his cousins, with the wool and hyssop, are for mares, and ailing dogs, and fowls that have the jaundice. Look at me now, Mother Meldrum, am I like a fool?" "Thou art, my son. Alas that it were any other. Now behold the end of that, John Ridd, mark the end of it." She pointed to the castle rock, where upon a narrow shelf, betwixt us and the coming stars, a bitter fight was raging. A fine fat sheep, with an honest face, had clomb up very carefully to browse on a bit of juicy grass, now the dew of the land was upon it. To him, from an upper crag, a lean black goat came hurrying, with leaps and skirmish of the horns, and an angry noise in his nostrils. The goat had grazed the place before, to the utmost of his liking, cropping in and out with jerks, as their manner is of feeding. Nevertheless, he fell on the sheep with fury and great malice. The simple wether was much inclined to retire from the contest, but looked around in vain for any way to peace and comfort. His enemy stood between him and the last leap he had taken. There was nothing left him but to fight, or be hurled into the sea 500 feet below. "Lie down, lie down!" I shouted to him as if he were a dog; for I had seen a battle like this before, and knew that the sheep had no chance of life except from his greater weight and the difficulty of moving him. Lie down, John Ridd!" cried Mother Meldrum, mocking me, but without a sign of smiling. The poor sheep turned, upon my voice, and looked at me so piteously, that I could look no longer, but ran with all my speed to try and save him from the combat. He saw that I could not be in time, for the goat was bucking to leap at him, and so the good wether stooped his forehead, with the harmless horns curling aside of it, and the goat flung his heels up and rushed at him, with quick sharp jumps and tricks of movement, and the points of his long horns always foremost, and his little scut cocked like a gun hammer. As I ran up the steep of the rock I could not see what they were doing, but the sheep must have fought very bravely at last, and yielded his ground quite slowly, and I hoped almost to save him. But just as my head topped the platform of rock, I saw him flung from it backward, with a sad low moan and a gurgle. His body made quite a short noise in the air, like a bucket thrown down a well shaft, and I could not tell when it struck the water, except by the echo among the rocks. So wroth was I with the goat at the moment, being somewhat scant of breath and unable to consider, that I caught him by the right hind leg, before he could turn from his victory, and hurled him after the sheep, to learn how he liked his own compulsion. End of chapter 18. Recording by Michelle Harris. Of Lorna Doone. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Michelle Harris. Lorna Doone by R.D. Blackmore. Chapter 19. Another Dangerous Interview. Although I left the Doones at once, having little heart for further questions of the wise woman, and being afraid to visit her house under the devil's cheese ring, to which she kindly invited me, and although I ran most part of the way, it was very late for farmhouse time upon a Sunday evening before I was back at Plover's Barrows. My mother had great desire to know all about the matter, but I could not reconcile it with my respect so to frighten her. Therefore I tried to sleep it off, keeping my own counsel, and when that proved of no avail, I strove to work it away, it might be, by heavy outdoor labour, and weariness, and good feeding. These indeed had some effect, and helped to pass a week or two, with more pain of hand than heart to me. But when the weather changed in earnest, and the frost was gone, and the south-west wind blew softly, and the lambs were at play with the daisies, it was more than I could do to keep from thought of Lorna. For now the fields were spread with growth, and the waters clad with sunshine, and light and shadow, step by step, wandered over the furzy cleaves. All the sides of the hilly wood were gathered in and out with green, silver grey, or russet points, according to the several manner of the trees beginning. And if one stood beneath an elm, with any heart to look at it, lo, all the ground was strewn with flakes, too small to know their meaning, and all the sprays above were rasped and trembling with a redness. And so I stopped beneath the tree, and carved L.D. upon it, and wondered at the buds of thought that seemed to swell inside me. The upshot of it all was this, that as no Lorna came to me, except in dreams or fancy, and as my life was not worth living without constant sign of her, forth I must again to find her, and say more than a man can tell. Therefore, without waiting longer for the moving of the spring, dressed I was in grand attire, so far as I had gotten it, and thinking my appearance good, although with doubts about it, being forced to dress in the hay tallet, round the corner of the wood stack went I very knowingly, for Lizzie's eyes were wondrous sharp, and then I was sure of meeting none who would care or dare to speak of me. It lay upon my conscience often that I had not made dear Annie secret to this history, although in all things I could trust her, and she loved me like a lamb. Many and many a time I tried, and more than once began the thing, but there came a dryness in my throat, and a knocking under the roof of my mouth, and a longing to put it off again, as perhaps might be the wisest. And then I would remember too that I had no right to speak of Lorna as if she were common property. This time I longed to take my gun, and was half resolved to do so, because it seemed so hard a thing to be shot at, and have no chance of shooting. But when I came to remember the steepness and the slippery nature of the water slide, there seemed but little likelihood of keeping dry the powder; therefore I was armed with nothing but a good stout holly staff, seasoned well for many a winter in our back kitchen chimney. Although my heart was leaping high with the prospect of some adventure, and the fear of meeting Lorna, I could not but be gladdened by the softness of the weather, and the welcome way of everything. There was that power all round, that power and that goodness, which make us come as it were outside our bodily selves, to share them. Over and beside us breathes the joy of hope and promise; under foot our troubles past; in the distance bowering newness tempts us ever forward; we quicken with largesse of life, and spring with vivid mystery. And in good sooth I had to spring, and no mystery about it, ere ever I got to the top of the rift leading into Doone glade. For the stream was rushing down in strength, and raving at every corner; a mort of rain having fallen last night, and no wind come to wipe it. However, I reached the head ere dark, with more difficulty than danger, and sat in a place which comforted my back and legs desirably. Hereupon I grew so happy at being on dry land again, and come to look for Lorna, with pretty trees around me, that what did I do but fall asleep with the holly stick in front of me, and my best coat sunk in a bed of moss, with water and wood sorrel. Mayhap I had not done so, nor yet enjoyed the spring so much, if so be I had not taken 3 parts of a gallon of cider at home at Plover's Barrows, because of the lowness and sinking ever since I met Mother Meldrum. There was a little runnel going softly down beside me, falling from the upper rock by the means of moss and grass, as if it feared to make a noise, and had a mother sleeping. Now and then it seemed to stop, in fear of its own dropping, and wait for some orders; and the blades of grass that straitened to it turned their points a little way, and offered their allegiance to wind instead of water. Yet before their carkled edges bent more than a driven saw, down the water came again with heavy drops and pats of running, and bright anger at neglect. This was very pleasant to me, now and then, to gaze at, blinking as the water blinked, and falling back to sleep again. Suddenly my sleep was broken by a shade cast over me. Between me and the low sunlight Lorna Doone was standing. "Master Ridd, are you mad?" she said, and took my hand to move me. "Not mad, but half asleep," I answered, feigning not to notice her, that so she might keep hold of me. Come away, if you care for your life; the patrol will be here directly. Be quick, Master Ridd, let me hide thee." "I will not stir a step," said I, though being in the greatest fright that might be well imagined, "unless you call me John." "Well, John, then, Master John Ridd, be quick, if you have any to care for you." "I have many that care for me," I said, just to let her know; "and I will follow you, Mistress Lorna, albeit without any hurry, unless there be peril to more than me." Without another word she led me, though with many timid glances towards the upper valley, to and into her little bower, where the inlet through the rock was. I am almost sure that I spoke before, though I cannot now go seek for it, and my memory is but a worn out tub, of a certain deep and perilous pit, in which I was like to drown myself through hurry and fright of boyhood. And even then I wondered greatly, and was vexed with Lorna for sending me in that heedless manner into such an entrance. But now it was clear that she had been right, and the fault mine own entirely; for the entrance to the pit was only to be found by seeking it. Inside the niche of native stone, the plainest thing of all to see, at any rate by daylight, was the stairway hewn from rock, and leading up the mountain, by means of which I had escaped, as before related. To the right side of this was the mouth of the pit, still looking very formidable, though Lorna laughed at my fear of it, for she drew her water thence. But on the left was a narrow crevice, very difficult to espy, and having a sweep of grey ivy laid, like a slouching beaver, over it. A man here, coming from the brightness of the outer air, with eyes dazed by the twilight, would never think of seeing this, and following it to its meaning. Lorna raised the screen for me, but I had much ado to pass, on account of bulk and stature. Instead of being proud of my size, as it seemed to me she ought to be, Lorna laughed so quietly that I was ready to knock my head or elbows against anything, and say no more about it. However, I got through at last without a word of compliment, and broke into the pleasant room, the lone retreat of Lorna. The chamber was of unhewn rock, round, as near as might be, 18 or 20 feet across, and gay with rich variety of fern and moss and lichen. The fern was in its winter still, or coiling for the springtide, but moss was in abundant life, some feathering, and some gobleted, and some with fringe of red to it. Overhead there was no ceiling but the sky itself, flaked with little clouds of April whitely wandering over it. The floor was made of soft low grass, mixed with moss and primroses, and in a niche of shelter moved the delicate wood sorrel. Here and there, around the sides, were chairs of living stone, as some Latin writer says, whose name has quite escaped me, and in the midst a tiny spring arose, with crystal beads in it, and a soft voice as of a laughing dream, and dimples like a sleeping babe. Then, after going round a little, with surprise of daylight, the water overwelled the edge, and softly went through lines of light, to shadows and an untold bourne. While I was gazing at all these things with wonder and some sadness, Lorna turned upon me lightly, as her manner was, and said, "Where are the new laid eggs, Master Ridd? Or hath Blue Hen ceased laying?" I did not altogether like the way in which she said it, with a sort of dialect, as if my speech could be laughed at. "Here be some," I answered, speaking as if in spite of her. "I would have brought thee twice as many, but that I feared to crush them in the narrow ways, Mistress Lorna." And so I laid her out 2 dozen upon the moss of the rock ledge, unwinding the wisp of hay from each, as it came safe out of my pocket. Lorna looked with growing wonder, as I added one to one, and when I had placed them side by side, and bidden her now to tell them, to my amazement, what did she do but burst into a flood of tears. "What have I done?" I asked, with shame, scarce daring even to look at her, because her grief was not like Annie's, a thing that could be coaxed away, and left a joy in going. "Oh, what have I done to vex you so?" "It is nothing done by you, Master Ridd," she answered very proudly, as if naught I did could matter. "It is only something that comes upon me with the scent of the pure true clover hay. Moreover, you have been too kind, and I am not used to kindness." Some sort of awkwardness was on me at her words and weeping, as if I would like to say something, but feared to make things worse perhaps than they were already. Therefore I abstained from speech, as I would in my own pain. And as it happened, this was the way to make her tell me more about it. Not that I was curious, beyond what pity urged me, and the strange affairs around her, and now I gazed upon the floor, lest I should seem to watch her. But none the less for that I knew all that she was doing. Lorna went a little way, as if she would not think of me nor care for one so careless, and all my heart gave a sudden jump, to go like a mad thing after her, until she turned of her own accord, and with a little sigh came back to me. Her eyes were soft with trouble's shadow, and the proud lift of her neck was gone, and beauty's vanity borne down by a woman's want of sustenance. "Master Ridd," she said, in the softest voice that ever flowed between 2 lips, "have I done aught to offend you?" Hereupon it went hard with me, not to catch her up and kiss her, in the manner in which she was looking; only it smote me suddenly that this would be a low advantage of her trust and helplessness. She seemed to know what I would be at, and to doubt very greatly about it, whether as a child of old she might permit the usage. All sorts of things went through my head, as I made myself look away from her, for fear of being tempted beyond what I could bear. And the upshot of it was that I said, within my heart and through it, "John Ridd, be on thy very best manners with this lonely maiden." Lorna liked me all the better for my good forbearance, because she did not love me yet, and had not thought about it, at least so far as I knew; And though her eyes were so beauteous, so very soft and kindly, there was, to my apprehension, some great power in them, as if she would not have a thing, unless her judgment leaped with it. But now her judgment leaped with me, because I had behaved so well, and being of quick urgent nature, such as I delight in, for the change from mine own slowness, she, without any let or hindrance, sitting over against me, now raising and now dropping fringe over those sweet eyes that were the road lights of her tongue, Lorna told me all about everything I wished to know, every little thing she knew, except indeed that point of points, how Master Ridd stood with her. Although it wearied me no whit, it might be wearisome for folk who cannot look at Lorna, to hear the story all in speech, exactly as she told it. Therefore let me put it shortly, to the best of my remembrance. Nay, pardon me, whosoever thou art, for seeming fickle and rude to thee. I have tried to do as first proposed, to tell the tale in my own words, as of another's fortune. But lo, I was beset at once with many heavy obstacles, which grew as I went onward, until I knew not where I was, and mingled past and present. And two of these difficulties only were enough to stop me: the one that I must coldly speak without the force of pity; the other that I, off and on, confused myself with Lorna, as might be well expected. Therefore let her tell the story, with her own sweet voice and manner, and if ye find it wearisome, seek in yourselves the weariness. End of chapter 19. Recording by Michelle Harris. Chapter 20 of Lorna Doone. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Michelle Harris. Lorna Doone by R.D. Blackmore. Chapter 20. Lorna begins her story. I cannot go through all my thoughts so as to make them clear to you, nor have I ever dwelt on things, to shape a story of them. I know not where the beginning was, nor where the middle ought to be, nor even how at the present time I feel, or think, or ought to think. If I look for help to those around me, who should tell me right and wrong, being older and much wiser, I meet sometimes with laughter, and at other times with anger. There are but two in the world who ever listen and try to help me. One of them is my grandfather, and the other is a man of wisdom whom we call the counsellor. My grandfather, Sir Ensor Doone, is very old and harsh of manner, except indeed to me. He seems to know what is right and wrong, but not to want to think of it. The counsellor, on the other hand, though full of life and subtleties, treats my questions as of play, and not gravely worth his while to answer, unless he can make wit of them. And among the women there are none with whom I can hold converse, since my Aunt Sabina died, who took such pains to teach me. She was a lady of high repute and lofty ways and learning, but grieved and harassed more and more by the coarseness and the violence and the ignorance around her. In vain she strove, from year to year, to make the young men hearken, to teach them what became their birth, and give them sense of honour. It was her favourite word, poor thing, and they called her Old Aunt Honour. Very often she used to say that I was her only comfort, and I am sure she was my only one, and when she died it was more to me than if I had lost a mother. For I have no remembrance now of father or of mother, although they say that my father was the eldest son of Sir Ensor Doone, and the bravest and the best of them, and so they call me heiress to this little realm of violence, and in sorry sport sometimes I am their princess or their queen. Many people living here, as I am forced to do, would perhaps be very happy, and perhaps I ought to be so. We have a beauteous valley, sheltered from the cold of winter and power of the summer sun, untroubled also by the storms and mists that veil the mountains, although I must acknowledge that it is apt to rain too often. The grass, moreover, is so fresh, and the brook so bright and lively, and flowers of so many hues come after one another that no one need be dull, if only left alone with them. And so in the early days, perhaps, when morning breathes around me, and the sun is going upward, and light is playing everywhere, I am not so far beside them all as to live in shadow. But when the evening gathers down, and the sky is spread with sadness, and the day has spent itself, then a cloud of lonely trouble falls, like night, upon me. I cannot see the things I quest for of a world beyond me. I cannot join the peace and quiet of the depth above me, neither have I any pleasure in the brightness of the stars. What I want to know is something none of them can tell me. What am I, and why set here, and when shall I be with them? I see that you are surprised a little at this my curiosity. Perhaps such questions never spring in any wholesome spirit, but they are in the depths of mine, and I cannot be quit of them. Meantime all around me is violence and robbery, coarse delight and savage pain, reckless joke and hopeless death. Is it any wonder that I cannot sink with these, that I cannot so forget my soul, as to live the life of brutes, and die the death more horrible because it dreams of waking? There is none to lead me forward, there is none to teach me right. Young as I am, I live beneath a curse that lasts forever. Here Lorna broke down for a while, and cried so very piteously that, doubting of my knowledge and of any power to comfort, I did my best to hold my peace, and tried to look very cheerful. Then, thinking that might be bad manners, I went to wipe her eyes for her. "Master Ridd," she began again, "I am both ashamed and vexed at my own childish folly. But you, who have a mother who thinks, you say, so much of you, and sisters and a quiet home, you cannot tell, it is not likely, what a lonely nature is, how it leaps in mirth sometimes, with only heaven touching it, and how it falls away desponding, when the dreary weight creeps on. It does not happen many times that I give way like this, more shame now to do so, when I ought to entertain you. Sometimes I am so full of anger that I dare not trust to speech, at things they cannot hide from me, and perhaps you would be much surprised that reckless men would care so much to elude a young girl's knowledge. They used to boast to Aunt Sabina of pillage and of cruelty, on purpose to enrage her, but they never boast to me. It even makes me smile sometimes to see how awkwardly they come and offer for temptation to me shining packets, half concealed, of ornaments and finery, of rings or chains or jewels, lately belonging to other people. But when I try to search the past, to get a sense of what befell me ere my own perception formed, to feel back for the lines of childhood, as a trace of gossamer, then I only know that naught lives longer than God wills it. So may after sin go by, for we are children always, as the counsellor has told me. So may we, beyond the clouds, seek this infancy of life, and never find its memory. But I am talking now of things which never come across me when any work is toward. It might have been a good thing for me to have had a father to beat these rovings out of me, or a mother to make a home and teach me how to manage it. For, being left with none, I think, and nothing ever comes of it, nothing, I mean, which I can grasp and have with any surety, nothing but faint images and wonderment and wandering. But often, when I am neither searching back into remembrance, nor asking of my parents, but occupied by trifles, something like a sign or message or a token of some meaning seems to glance upon me, whether from the rustling wind, or sound of distant music, or the singing of a bird, like the sun on snow it strikes me with a pain of pleasure. And often when I wake at night, and listen to the silence, or wander far from people in the grayness of the evening, or stand and look at quiet water having shadows over it, some vague image seems to hover on the skirt of vision, ever changing place and outline, ever flitting as I follow. This so moves and hurries me, in the eagerness and longing, that straightway all my chance is lost, and memory, scared like a wild bird, flies. Or am I as a child perhaps, chasing a flown cageling, who among the branches free plays and peeps at the offered cage, as a home not to be urged on him, and means to take his time of coming, if he comes at all. Often too I wonder at the odds of fortune, which made me, helpless as I am, and fond of peace and reading, the heiress of this mad domain, the sanctuary of unholiness. It is not likely that I shall have much power of authority, and yet the counsellor creeps up to be my lord of the treasury, and his son aspires to my hand, as of a royal alliance. Well, honour among thieves, they say, and mine is the first honour, although among decent folk perhaps honesty is better. We should not be so quiet here, and safe from interruption, but that I have begged one privilege rather than commanded it. This was that the lower end, just this narrowing of the valley, where it is most hard to come at, might be looked upon as mine, except for purposes of guard. Therefore none beside the sentries ever trespass on me here, unless it be my grandfather, or the counsellor, or Carver. By your face, Master Ridd, I see that you have heard of Carver Doone. For strength and courage and resource he bears the first repute among us, as might well be expected from the son of the counsellor. But he differs from his father in being very hot and savage, and quite free from argument. The counsellor, who is my uncle, gives his son the best advice, commending all the virtues with eloquence and wisdom, yet himself abstaining from them accurately and impartially. You must be tired of this story, and the time I take to think, and the weakness of my telling. But my life from day to day shows so little variance. Among the writers there is none whose safe return I watch for, I mean none more than other. And indeed there seems no risk, all are now so feared of us. Neither of the old men is there whom I can revere or love, except alone my grandfather, whom I love with trembling. Neither of the women any whom I like to deal with, unless it be a little maiden whom I saved from starving. A little Cornish girl she is, and shaped in western manner, not so very much less in width than if you take her lengthwise. Her father seems to have been a miner, a Cornishman, as she declares, of more than average excellence, and better than any 2 men to be found in Devonshire, or any 4 in Somerset. Very few things can have been beyond his power of performance, and yet he left his daughter to starve upon a peat rick. She does not know how this was done, and looks upon it as a mystery, the meaning of which will some day be clear, and redound to her father's honour. His name was Simon Carfax, and he came as the captain of a gang from one of the Cornish stannaries. Gwenny Carfax, my young maid, well remembers how her father was brought up from Cornwall. Her mother had been buried, just a week or so before, and he was sad about it, and had been off his work, and was ready for another job. Then people came to him by night and said that he must want a change, and everybody lost their wives, and work was the way to mend it. So what with grief and overthought and the inside of a square bottle, Gwenny says they brought him off to become a mighty captain, and choose the country round. The last she saw of him was this, that he went down a ladder somewhere on the wilds of Exmoor, leaving her with bread and cheese, and his travelling hat to see to, and from that day to this he never came above the ground again, so far as we can hear of. But Gwenny, holding to his hat, and having eaten the bread and cheese, when he came no more to help her, dwelt 3 days near the mouth of the hole, and then it was closed over the while that she was sleeping. With weakness and with want of food she lost herself distressfully, and went away for miles or more, and lay upon a peat rick, to die before the ravens. That very day I chanced to return from Aunt Sabina's dying place, for she would not die in Glen Doone, she said, lest the angels feared to come for her, and so she was taken to a cottage in a lonely valley. I was allowed to visit her, for even we durst not refuse the wishes of the dying, and if a priest had been desired, we should have made bold with him. Returning very sorrowful, and caring now for nothing, I found this little stray thing lying, her arms upon her, and not a sign of life, except the way that she was biting. Black root stuff was in her mouth, and a piece of dirty sheep's wool, and at her feet an old egg-shell of some bird of the moorland. I tried to raise her, but she was too square and heavy for me, and so I put food in her mouth, and left her to do right with it. And this she did in a little time, for the victuals were very choice and rare, being what I had taken over to tempt poor Aunt Sabina. Gwenny ate them without delay, and then was ready to eat the basket and the ware that contained them. Gwenny took me for an angel, though I am little like one, as you see, Master Ridd, and she followed me, expecting that I would open wings and fly when we came to any difficulty. I brought her home with me, so far as this can be a home, and she made herself my sole attendant without so much as asking me. She has beaten 2 or 3 other girls, who used to wait upon me, until they are afraid to come near the house of my grandfather. She seems to have no kind of fear even of our roughest men, and yet she looks with reverence and awe upon the counsellor. As for the wickedness and theft and revelry around her, she says it is no concern of hers, and they know their own business best. By this way of regarding men she has won upon our riders, so that she is almost free from all control of place and season, and is allowed to pass where none even of the youths may go. Being so wide and short and flat, she has none to pay her compliments, and, were there any, she would scorn them, as not being Cornishmen. Sometimes she wanders far, by moonlight, on the moors and up the rivers, to give her father, as she says, another chance of finding her, and she comes back not a whit defeated, or discouraged, or depressed, but confident that he is only waiting for the proper time. Herein she sets me good example of a patience and contentment hard for me to imitate. Oftentimes I am vexed by things I cannot meddle with, yet which cannot be kept from me, that I am at the point of flying from this dreadful valley, and risking all that can betide me in the unknown outer world. If it were not for my grandfather, I would have done so long ago, but I cannot bear that he should die with no gentle hand to comfort him, and I fear to think of the conflict that must ensue for the government, if there be a disputed succession. Ah me, we are to be pitied greatly, rather than condemned, by people whose things we have taken from them. For I have read, and seem almost to understand about it, that there are places on the earth where gentle peace, and love of home, and knowledge of one's neighbours prevail, and are, with reason, looked for as the usual state of things. There honest folk may go to work in the glory of the sunrise, with hope of coming home again quite safe in the quiet evening, and finding all their children. And even in the darkness they have no fear of lying down and dropping off to slumber, and hearken to the wind of night, not as to an enemy trying to find entrance, but a friend who comes to tell the value of their comfort. Of all this golden ease I hear, but never saw the like of it, and haply I shall never do so, being born to turbulence. Once indeed I had the offer of escape, and kinsman's aid, and high place in the gay bright world, and yet I was not tempted much, or, at least, dared not to trust it. And it ended very sadly, so dreadfully that I even shrink from telling you about it, for that one terror changed my life, in a moment, at a blow, from childhood and from thoughts of play and commune with the flowers and trees, to a sense of death and darkness, and a heavy weight of earth. Be content now, Master Ridd, ask me nothing more about it, so your sleep be sounder. But I, John Ridd, being young and new, and very fond of hearing things to make my blood to tingle, had no more of manners than to urge poor Lorna onwards, hoping, perhaps, in depth of heart, that she might have to hold by me, when the worst came to the worst of it. Therefore she went on again. End of chapter 20. Recording by Michelle Harris.